So regardless of the fact that we as human beings breathe the same air, but there's a huge discrepancy amongst humanity. The history, particularly of that discrepancy, depends really on your appreciation of history, how you've been schooled, or perhaps even your religion. But it's something that's apparent. Everybody can see it. Everybody can notice it, that as human beings dwelling on this planet Earth, there is a discrepancy. We are not the same. You could be wondering, like me, where those discrepancies came from, what the difference, where the inequalities that we see amongst humanity actually comes from, since we identify with the same needs. So today on this video, I'm going to talk about the history of the discrepancy that is caused by race. I'll talk about the history of racism, and I'm going to do it in a very brief format. So my name is Ignatius, and this is my very first YouTube video. So thank you so much for watching and welcome to my channel. I love to comment on issues affecting humanity on the world stage, on the global stage. So that is my passion. So the purpose of this channel generally will be discussing about issues affecting humanity. Whichever corner of the world that you stay, you're going to hear me talking about you and what's affecting you and what my perspective is about the issues that are going on in that particular area. So I'm pretty obvious that many of the discussions that I'm going to trigger on this channel are going to help somebody to live a more fulfilling life and to understand what's happening and what's happening around them, and demystify some of the things that we just found ourselves in this village that we are all locked up in, this village called planet Earth. Feel free to differ with me in the comment box, in the comment section. Let's meet there. Let's discuss. Let's jump onto today's subject. What are we going to talk about today? Today we're gonna just talk about the history of racism, history of the discrepancy between races. Where did that come from? In a future video, I'm going to talk about the reason why racism still exists in the 21st century. It's surprising. So keep with me and follow the next video that I'm going to upload. So the first thing that really caused this difference in terms of races is the issue of territories or territorial supremacy. You see, as individuals began to conquer each other in order to gain territory, the way the world was ordered in the long past, in ancient times, it was ordered in a manner that the family that will be the strongest in terms of military prowess is the one that will be ruling all other families. So, as one family conquers another family, and they join up and they conquer others, and they conquer and they conquer and they conquer, it established a system of governance called a monarchy, whereby the father will be the one that will be ruling many families, many people, many tribes, right? And when the father dies, the eldest son is the one that takes over from the father. And when the eldest son dies, his eldest son takes over, going like that, like that, like that, like that. So the world in those particular times began to develop systems of hierarchy in terms of social classes, whereby people belonging to the king were labeled as people that are royal, the royal family, and those that are related will be telling themselves, no, we are related to the royalty. And by so doing, as that system developed over time, it developed the issue of other people being treated as mere underdogs because they do not have military prowess, as slaves. So you find when you read the Bible and when you read the Quran or many history books, they will tell you about slavery and how people would conquer other people's territory, and the conquered would then become, sometimes they'll become a little state that will be under the bigger kingdom. there's a technical term that they'll use in history. They'll call that term a vassal state. So that state will become a vassal state, and that vassal state will be reporting to the bigger kingdom. And in order to show that the vassal state is really submitting itself to the kingdom, they'll be paying what was known as tribute. Nowadays, we call them taxes. So in the Bible or in the Quran, you also read about a man called Moses. Moses is one person who wrote a lot about laws to do with slaves and how slaves were to be treated, and how in the Bible they'll say that when you beat your slave, you're not supposed to beat them until they die. Should beat them at least to an extent that they almost die, or if they are to die, they die at least after 3 days or so, not to die instantly. If you beat up your slave, suppose they've done you wrong, and they die instantly, that was considered a punishable offense. So we read that in the history of the Bible, in the Quran, and many other history books. You find that information is gathered there. Now, coming down to a history that most of us, we all know about, the history that's been recorded, that's more current, a history that has been acted upon on certain movies. You come to the history of the 14th, 15th, and 16th century, around the time when America was first, discovered. I say discovered in quotes because the people that actually discovered America, they say they discovered it, but there are people that were staying there, were living there, the natives of America, but that's a subject for another day. So during that time, there were Christians who read the books of Moses in Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, in the Bible. And from those books, they interpreted, starting from the book of Genesis, actually, the story of Noah, the story of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So they read about the curse that was made by Noah to one of his sons, and by the name Ham, and the curse was actually made to the grandchild whose name is called Canaan. So those Christians were very studious. They understood the Bible. They studied the history, the generations of the Bible up until their time. And they discovered that they belong to the tribe of Japheth, from the 3 sons of Noah. And if you go to the Bible and read what Noah said about Japheth, it said that Japheth was going to be great, and Japheth was going to be above his brothers, and was going to be great. And Shem also was going to be a great person. But as for Canaan, Canaan was going to be a slave, and the timeline for his slavery is not particularly mentioned in the Bible. So these Judas, white Christians, they then digged into the history to want to find out who exactly are the descendants of Ham, and into Canaan, who are the descendants of Canaan. And they discovered, oh, well, these are the group of people who are the descendants of Canaan. And the descendants of Canaan, according to those Christian students, were the African people. They are black African people. So what did they do? They decided to continue with the institution of slavery as it is mentioned and permitted in the Bible according to their reading. So what did they do? They started sailing their ships down to Africa, especially the middle part of Africa, East, Western, and Central Africa. They began to forcibly take the black men, black women, black children to America and some Western countries, and make them work in their cotton fields, in their sugarcane fields, etc. Doing that, justifying those particular, we can say they are ferocious deeds in our time, but according to them, they were not, because they were only following the biblical instruction. So the history went on until America was later organized into a nation, right? And the Declaration of Independence for the United States of America was crafted. And in that bill, the Declaration of that document, the Declaration of Industry, it says all men are created equal. And when they said man in that particular document, they were actually referring to men as in males. And they were also referring to man as white males, because that's what they understood during that time. That's how they took it, how they interpreted the reality of human existence. The United States began to have presidents, starting with the first president of the United States, which is George Washington, and it went on and on and on and on up until a certain president who is well known both in Christendom and in history. His name is called Abraham Lincoln. 1 January 1863, the then president of the United States, whose name was Abraham Lincoln, like I've mentioned earlier on, he made an emancipation proclamation where he rendered all slaves free, and he declared that all human beings this time, black and white, are equal and are to be treated as equal, and all those that owned slaves were supposed to free them. So that was the beginning of the end of slavery, or the beginning of the end of racism. So by the time we get to 2023, 2024, we should be talking about something else. And exactly, we are talking about something else because the world's governing body, the United Nations, and all the countries that subscribe to the United Nations, it has principles that govern how humanity is supposed to live on this planet Earth. And one of the principles that that governing body says is that all human beings are supposed to be treated as equal, and there should not be any discrimination in terms of race. People are supposed to be equal, black and white. It started 1863. Who made that proclamation is President Abraham Lincoln. But it didn't come without difficulty, because in 1865, one person who thought Mr. Lincoln had infringed in his rights by restricting him from owning slaves, assassinated President Abraham Lincoln for that reason. So history went on up until the end of the 19th century. End of the 19th century, what do we see? We see 7 European countries jumping onto the African continent, scrambling for the African continent, and then they partitioned the African continent amongst themselves. The reasoning in their minds was that there is nothing happening in Africa, there is no civilization happening in Africa, and hence the African land is unoccupied. So that in itself sort of prolonged the issue of this discrepancy amongst humanity in terms of race. By around 1914, the process of scrambling and partitioning Africa was done. In Asia, certain countries again went to colonize Asian countries like India, like Palestine, like Bangladesh. They were also colonized, or resulting in an inferiority and superiority complex. In the 20th century, the middle of the 19th, certain legal cases continued to be brought to the Supreme Court of the then biggest nation on planet Earth, or the superpower on planet Earth, which is the United States of America. And in those cases came a certain statement, or an acceptable legal standing that stated that though black people and white people are equal, they are equal, but they are separate. Equality does not mean that they should be combined together. They should be equal, yes, because we breathe the same air, etc., but we are separate. Now, in 1954, there is a case that was brought to the Supreme Court of the United States of America, the case between Brown and the Board of Education, where Brown et al. Were challenging the Board of Education based on the principle of equal but separate. Some white people were gathering their children into public schools, private schools, where Black people were not allowed to be part of. So what was noted was that there was an anomaly between the public schools and the private schools. The private schools had better facilities than the public schools. So Brown et al. Were complaining to the Board of Education, and they took the matter up until it got to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled that it was a violation of the United States of American Constitution to have separate schools for white people and separate people where both white and Black people could enroll in. So the United States of America, it put some very punitive taxes on the schools that continued to discriminate against race. It is somehow sad to note that this issue of racism, or the discrepancy between race, continued to be prolonged by Christians because of their reading of the Bible. Most prominent and powerful preachers during that particular time. One of them, you'll find him on Google, his name was called Jarifal Sr., was one of the proponents of the issue of equal but separate, based on the story of Noah, among others, and how they read the Bible. So the story continues up until we get to the 1960s, 70s, into 80s, where we see the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement was generally a group of people who fought for the equality of humanity based on race. They fought for the discrimination of people, be it at the workplace and in society in general, based on race. And certain laws began to be enacted, particularly in the United States and in some Western countries, that went against the issue of racism. So fast forward to the year 2000, going down to 2014, 2015, 16, 17, countries around the world, including the UN itself, everyone, humanity, began to understand that humanity as a whole, we are equal. And many proponents began to spring up from each and every country. Some of them were actually white. Some white people actually writing, some white people going to the public to fight this issue of racism. Then when we get to 2020, that was on May 25 in 2020, most people know about it. It's the death of George Floyd. I'm going to cover that in a certain video in future, which showed that we still have a problem of racism even in the 21st century. George Floyd was recorded being pinned down by a certain white police officer who believed that Floyd was a criminal, mainly because in the United States of America in particular, there is still that discrepancy between these two races, Black and white, and there's still that distrust between these two races, that is Black and white. And here we are now. We are now 3 years later from 2020. We are now in 2023. So basically, in summary, that is the history of racism, general basic understanding of the history of racism. So on my next video on this channel, I'm going to argue why racism still exists even in the 21st century. So if you liked what I shared so far, please click the like button, click subscribe to this channel, and we're going to see more. We're going to be discussing more to do with humanity and how we are living, adjusting, and understanding each other as we cohabit in this planet.